You are trespassing. Sorry, bro. Sorry, not sorry. Get off our land. Period.
Hamadak Yapi, Nick Tilsen Amat Yapi, Chantea Washte Nape Chuzapalo. I'm your host here on LANDBACK For the People. As a reminder, this podcast, LANDBACK, is about lifting up the story of Indigenous people across Turtle Island and really across the world who are fighting for the return of stolen Indigenous lands back into Indigenous hands. In this podcast, we cover a wide variety of different topics, ranging from over-policing, militarization, the legal system, all the different systems that were put in place. Most of the legal systems that exist in this country were put in place for the purpose of stealing Indigenous people's land, for the purpose of extracting resources, in the pursuit of capitalism and so-called American democracy. And so in this revolutionary movement that is decentralized, that nobody controls, but many people throughout the Indigenous world are contributing to. It's a movement that is not only about the return of physical land, but it's the reclaiming of our power. And that's why I keep leaning into, as we talk about land back, it is actually a liberation framework. It is a movement that is dedicated to the liberation of Indigenous people and our homelands. Because as we liberate our people and as we reclaim our lands, it heals our people. It rebuilds our food systems. It rebuilds our economic systems. It rebuilds our familial and societal systems. Because when in the process of the stealing of the land, they attempted to steal our language. They attempted to steal our means to feed ourselves, to house ourselves. And so this movement is about this country entering into an era of repair. Often people have referred to land back as reparations framework. And if you think about reparations, the core word in reparations is repair. And the only way that we can achieve social justice for Indigenous people in this framework is to begin to talk about the land. You cannot talk about achieving repair or social justice with Indigenous people in this country or in this world unless you can start to talk about the return of stolen Indigenous lands back into Indigenous hands. That means jurisdiction, that means title, that means stewardship, that means control, decision-making power over our own lands and lives of our people. And so in this episode of LANDBACK For the People, we're going to dig into some amazing examples that have strengthened tribal sovereignty, that have led to actual land back, knowing that these court systems that have been created are absolutely colonial. They were not created with the intention in mind to be walls of justice for Indigenous people. They were not intended to be a way to further human rights or civil rights for Indigenous people. In fact, they were used and weaponized as a tool, as the very tool to not only be the tool to steal our land, but for the tool to maintain the continued theft of our lands. Even with all those terrible intentions, we have seen a rise of modern warriors and lawyers who are entering into those halls to deconstruct those spaces to advance the rights of Indigenous people and the return of our lands. And we have some very special guests on this show that have been successful. So we are going to talk about some victories here. We're going to talk about some concrete examples about how we have gotten land back, how we have changed jurisdiction, how we have advanced the rights of Indigenous people, how we have shut down pipelines, and how we have used the legal system to do that. The movement, the land back movement, did not come from some think tank. It did not come from some lawyers. It came from the front lines. It came from the front lines of many of us throughout the Indigenous world who were organizing on the front lines, risking our lives, risking our bodies, risking our freedoms, because we believed that, and the saying that we would always say on the front line is, only if we had our land back, we wouldn't have to be fighting this battle, because they would need our consent to do this to us, to do this to our homelands. And that spirit of every frontline struggle that I've ever been a part of for the past 20 plus years, that's what I've heard. And that was the spirit in which the land back movement was born. We also recognize that land back in this movement, it didn't just arrive one day. It didn't just pop up one day. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who gave their lives in the pursuit of fighting for our land, fighting for our rights, fighting for our identities, fighting for our language, fighting for our ceremonies. And so many warriors that have come before, so many matriarchs that have come before, have paved the foundation that we stand on. And so in every time I talk about land back, I always pay homage to our ancestors, always pay homage to our leaders of the past, our elders that are present, who are still learning from, and remembering that this movement is a continuation. And it is the same thing in the legal struggle. There has been warriors in the legal space who've been fighting for quite some time. And so we're going to get into it. We have some incredible guests. We're joined today by Phillip Tinker, who's a citizen of the Osage Nation, who is an attorney and works with the firm Kanji
Katzen.
Kanji and Katzen. I tried like 3 times before we started recording to catch that, but I knew I was going to miss it. He focuses his time on litigation around Indigenous people's rights, tribal sovereignty, but particularly around treaty law and land rights. And so welcome to the show, Phillip. And we also have here Nicole Yanes from the Opata Nation. She's a member of the Opata Nation. She's the director of Grantmaking here at Indian Collective. So if anybody wants money, talk to Nicole. But in all reality, Nicole and a whole team of matriarchs here at Indian Collective are rematriating resources throughout the Indigenous world. And they are rematriating resources in the form of grants for the work around food sovereignty, the protection of Indigenous languages, rebuilding food systems, fighting climate change. And since our inception here at Indian Collective, we've given over $50 million to over 700 organizations throughout North America. And Nicole has been a big part of that work, along with being a longtime organizer in her community, particularly around the work of food sovereignty and the rebuilding of food systems and trade systems. So with all that said, we're gonna jump into it and have each of you give a chance to introduce yourselves. And we'll start with Phillip.
Thank you, Nick, and I want to extend my thanks to Indian Collective. I've been lucky enough. You've had me out here this week, and I've been able to meet the team and collaborate a little bit, and you've rolled out the red carpet for me, and I really appreciate that. As Nick said, I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation. My Osage name, Wajahunka. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Kanji Katzen. We're a 13-attorney firm, and we dedicate our practice exclusively to representation of tribal governments with the goal of uplifting tribes, enhancing, enforcing their sovereignty in whatever way our tribal clients need. So our mission is litigation focused. We work within the federal courts. We work sometimes in the state courts, but it's always a focus of expanding, enhancing tribal rights through the legal structures provided by the federal and state colonial governments.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you on this show, and thank you for your awesome work. Nicole?
Thank you for having me here. My name is Nicole Yanes. I'm from the Opata Nation and director of Grantmaking with the Indian Foundation, as you mentioned. Contact us if you have projects or are a change maker and our artists. We have resources for our people, and that's our work there, to give it back to our people, the resources that are liberated from these institutions. And it's an honor to be here. Thank you for all the listeners who have been following this show. Really glad that we have something on our own terms, that we can say the truth from our own perspective. So really good to be here with all of you.
Land back for the people. Okay, we're going to jump into one of these cases. Many of you may have heard in the news, you've heard of Mcgirt versus Oklahoma. And you might have heard this is a great thing for Indigenous people. And it's a great thing for land rights. And it's a great thing for tribal sovereignty. But why? And so, Phillip, many of us out here in the world, we are not lawyers. Some of us have been advised to not become lawyers. But you are, and you've been doing this work behalf and with Indigenous people. Can you break down what Mcgirt versus Oklahoma was all about, and why is it? Why does it have a relationship to land back?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And I'll just start with the conclusion, and maybe we can work from there. The ultimate holding takeaway from the Mcgirt decision, which was decided by the United States Supreme Court in 2020, it recognized that the Muskogee Creek Nation still had the right to enforce the treaty promises granted to it in 1832, 1833, 1866, treaties that were signed by the nation with the United States at the time when they were forced off of their ancestral homelands in the Southeast and relocated to Oklahoma. The price paid for the Trail of Tears, which, all of us are familiar with, blood, tears, land, their identity and homeland. The tribes were stripped of these things and forced to move at gunpoint in chains to Oklahoma with the promise that these new lands, will be protected for you in perpetuity under federal law. Through the course of history, the lands were largely taken, opened up to white settlement. Those promises were broken. But the promise contained in those treaties that the tribe would still have jurisdiction, autonomy, governmental authority within those boundaries, that promise was not taken away under law. It was ignored. It was suppressed by the state and federal governments throughout the 20th century. But the case of Mcgirt gave the Supreme Court the opportunity to revindicate those rights in the modern period, and that's what the court did.
So what does that mean? So so all of that work, they broke all these promises, stolen land, the story after story of every Indigenous community in this country, and the story of colonization in the pursuit of so-called American democracy. And now, why does legal jurisdiction matter when it comes to the fight for the return of land and the strengthening of tribal sovereignty?
Well, the very notion of land back, as you got to so eloquently in your introduction, is the recognition that stealing of the land is part and parcel with stealing of everything that, the colonial governments can steal from Indigenous communities. Take the land, you take the culture, you take the language, and land encompasses so much more than just the ground, just the resources, just the title. Land encompasses a homeland, a community. One aspect of land would be the authority to govern, for the group, the leadership, the community to have authority. So the case of Mcgirt recognized, it recognized that governmental power promised to the tribes in Oklahoma had not been taken. And so when it is re-recognized in the modern era, that means it is what, in today's legal parlance is known as a reservation. We're all familiar with reservations, but what reservation provides as a legal mechanism is authority of the tribe to control land use, housing, provide medical, provide assistance, protect tribal members from state regulation, protection from taxes, tax advantage, business advantage, things that come part and parcel with being a government and being able to enforce home rule within your jurisdiction. These are the things that having recognized reservation rights for the tribes in eastern Oklahoma, this is what was illegally, unlawfully taken from them and restored under Mcgirt.
So how much land are we talking? Are we talking, as far as the eye can see in Oklahoma, or what are we talking here?
Oklahoma, when it came into the Union as a state, it was a combination between two territories. The Oklahoma Territory in the western half of the state, containing roughly Oklahoma City westward through the Panhandle. Pardon me. That was already subject to colonial settlement at the time of statehood. The eastern half of the state, roughly 40% of the land mass, encompassing Tulsa, encompassing everything to the south. This was, at the time prior to statehood, Indian territory belonging primarily to the 5 tribes. And those lands have now all been re-recognized as reservation land. So roughly 40% now of the state of Oklahoma, including the city of Tulsa, are recognized reservation lands.
Land back in action. I'm gonna come over here to Nicole as a longtime organizer, as a fighter for Indigenous people's land and in human rights and inherent rights. Why is this work that is happening in the courts so important, and how does it land in community and in the movement and into the lives and of the people that you have been working with and organizing throughout your life?
Mm-hmm. If I can add, thank you for that question, but if I can add, what Mcgirt really meant is that the treaties were upheld. We're seeing here in the Constitution, Article 6 of the Constitution, all treaties made or shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And that's what this case did. It upheld those treaties between 2 nations or multiple nations. And, either treaties are violated or they're upheld. And in this case, going into the courts, it re-established the reservation for these 5 tribes in Oklahoma and allowed them to have the reservation and not be taken away. The reservation was going to be taken away. It wasn't a case between Mcgirt versus Oklahoma. It wasn't a case between just 2 Indians, 2 natives. It was a case, it was going to signal that the states had jurisdiction over tribal lands. It was going to signal that, and these treaties were made before statehood, as you mentioned, right? So treaties were made between nations, and that's what this case meant. The upholding of this treaty rights, and therefore the tribes being able to have autonomy and jurisdiction and sovereignty of their lands and over their tribal citizens, and it was going to ripple, throughout the United States. Because that's what this case was trying to do, is to give more power to the cities, more power to the states. As Indian nations in the United States, we don't need to be negotiating or talking to the states. Our cases between our tribal citizens do not have to be in the state courts. They need to be in federal courts, tribal courts, because that's where this, treaties were made. And that's where, in tribal courts, because that's where the citizens should be tried or address whatever issues are happening. So that's what it means to me. And the reason why it's so important, let me just say, as an organizer, this did not happen just through lawyers. It happened through so many years of organizing, students organizing, myself organizing, introducing lawyers who saw through the lines, who saw that it wasn't a case between 2 natives, that it was bigger than that. Organizing and introducing them with the Micos in Oklahoma, introducing them to the city council, the tribal councils, in Creek and Seminole, that all happened through treaty meetings that I was organizing. That was like, hey, let me introduce you to this. They didn't know they were about to lose their reservation. So it took years of organizing before it got to fighting it. And there was a lot of pushback from lawyers, from law schools, let's say even that, that said, you can't open this case because if we lose, what does that mean? Because if we lose, we're not going to be able to do this in the future. We're not going to be able to file this claim in the future. Well, if we can't do it now, then when? If we cannot win this right now, then when are we going to win this? In 10, 15 years and lose the rest, and for this 5 tribes to lose their reservations? So it took a lot of years of organizing and a lot of years of fighting and a lot of years of before I even got to the courts. And so that's why I think when we talk about jurisdiction, this, Nick, as you're doing a lot of land back work with different tribes, jurisdiction happens in the court. The land back, in actuality, it means a lot more. It means the reclaiming of our cultures, as you mentioned, our language. It means reclaiming of our everything that was taken from us. However, in terms of actuality of land returning to Indigenous peoples, that work is a jurisdiction change, and that happens in the courts. And that's why it's so important that we engage to actually get land back. However, there's so much work behind. There's so many people, as you mentioned, our elders, the cultural leaders like the Micos in Oklahoma that were behind this and that organized and backed it before it even got to the courts.
And the fact that people prayed on it, people had ceremony on it. There was intentions put out into there. And so a lot of times, in the movement, when we talk about land back by any means necessary, automatically the other side just assumes that means some narrow focus of radicalism, when the reality is, when we say by any means necessary, we're talking about multifaceted, multi-pronged approach to achieve justice and ultimately liberation. And so that takes a spiritual strategy, a cultural strategy, a community organizing strategy, and a legal one. Yes. This is such a good example that as you're out there organizing and as you're out there fighting the system, that it's so important that people understand that victories are on our cusps. That all of this work, all of this intention, all of this prayer, all this organizing, the countless hours that you'd stayed up late at night or to early in the morning, pushing paperwork, trying to analyze and make that legal case, it's all related with one another. And that's the thing I love about this story, is that it is a story of a lot of work that many people throughout Indian country are familiar with, but a lot of the stories don't end this way. And the last question I want to ask you before we transition to another example is just, what kind of precedent does this set? Like, what does this mean for the future of Indigenous nations, working to get our land back?
Well, ultimately, I think there are 2 key precedents that come from this. And first, the case was only brought by the Creek Nation, and in fact, a Creek citizen, but the Creek Nation intervened at the Supreme Court to promote its own treaty rights. And so the Creek Nation treaties were the only one vindicated by that decision. But in very short order, the other 5 tribes, other tribes in Oklahoma, brought similar suits and had their reservations recognized as well. So other tribes that have similar treaty rights recognizing their reservation, their jurisdiction, if they haven't been enforced up until the modern period, it opens the door for that specifically. But more broadly, the decision that was laid out by Justice Gorsuch, he wrote the majority opinion with 4 other justices signing on, it marks possibly the strongest language in Supreme Court precedent in favor of enforcing and upholding treaty rights. If tribes have been given a right in a treaty, those were very hard-fought rights at a very uneven bargaining table where the federal government had the power to set the terms. And even after those treaties were put into place, the court continues to recognize Congress, the federal government, can change them at will. They don't have to honor those promises if they don't want to. But the one protection in court that tribes have against that is that the courts force Congress to act very directly and explicitly. If they're going to take that right away, they have to do it above the table. They have to do it on paper. And if they haven't done that, if they haven't written out, we hereby abrogate this treaty, all treaty rights for this tribe are wiped out. If they haven't done something like that, the treaty right survives. And so that's the power that tribes have under this precedent. If you have a right, if it hasn't been taken, you're entitled to enforce it.
Awesome. Yeah, the pathway forward is that has been paved by this is massive. I start, telling people all throughout Indian country, you better dust off those treaties because the violation of those treaties are a violation of the Constitution. And if this, you hear many people talk about the rule of law. Many politicians talk about we need to follow the rule of law. The Constitution is, the bedrock of the American democracy. All of these things. I would say, have you read that? When's the last time you read the Constitution? When's the last time that you referred to, do you know that Article 6, refers to that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so therefore every treaty violated is also a violation of the U.S. Constitution. And that every time that you violated a treaty with Indian people, you are also weakening the very democracy in which you say that you are standing up and fighting for,
As Indigenous people, we share collective understanding even through our differing languages. We remain in search of ways to convey meaning and honor the roots of our experiences. Radical may mean many things to many people, but its essence requires us to get to the root of things. Indian Collective is proud to present the Radical Imagination Experience, the art of creative resistance and change, showcasing the 2021 Radical Imagination artists who embrace the radical and give breath to Indigenous imagination. Kick off your Santa Fe Indian Market weekend with us for a free immersive event with panel discussions, visual art making for youth, and live music performances. To learn more, follow Indian Collective on all social media platforms. We can't wait to see you there.
So there's many water protectors throughout Indian country. There's many frontline activists. There's many warriors that have fought for Mini Wichoni, for water is life, for the sacred water that brings life to our people. And we have engaged in pipeline fights, for decades and decades, whether it be a LNG pipeline, whether it be No DAPL pipeline, whether it be the Line 3 pipeline, whether it be the Line 5 pipeline. And there's been many people organizing around the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline fight. And there was a recent decision. And this recent decision, Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa Indians versus our Enbridge Energy LP, this fight was also a successful battle that helped stop a portion of this pipeline, and in the effort of not only stopping this pipeline, it also strengthened tribal sovereignty. And this shows that, for people fighting climate change around the world, for people who are trying to advance human rights, civil rights in this country and around the world, Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, and the exercise of that sovereignty is an avid avenue to fight for the protection of Mother Earth on behalf of all of humanity. These aren't just ideological things that we talk about and say, but in action, this particular case helped achieve that. And so Phillip, can you break down a little bit what happened in this particular case, and what it means?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And the case we're discussing, Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Tribe of Chippewa Indians of the Bad River Reservation versus Enbridge Energy, is a case that we filed in 2019 after the Bad River Band had spent significant years, time, resources, effort previously fighting this particular battle. It was a trespass lawsuit primarily against Enbridge, who was operating Line 5 pipeline within and through the band's reservation. This pipeline was installed in 1953. The federal law for pipelines within Indian country give the tribes the authority to approve or reject pipeline infrastructure. In 1953, the tribe certainly had no effective autonomy to actually reject that. It was a process proposed and pushed through by the federal government. The tribe had no real effective say.
Just for the audience, at that time in history, they were making huge steps towards termination. And so if you imagine the era in which this happened, they were all these corporations were taking advantage of the political climate in the country where they were terminating tribes. Sorry to interrupt, but I just important for the audience to understand what was happening in that history where they were actually terminating tribes and had a relocation policy to move Indigenous people to urban centers.
Absolutely correct. That was a time when tribes across the nation were on the chopping block, as they had been so many times before, but this was one of the low points of tribal resource and tribal autonomy. Projects like this were able to be pushed through with the support of the federal government and very little say on behalf of the tribes.
And I think this is a violation of FPIC, right? Free, prior, and informed consent, that the tribe approved in 1973, 1983. But by the time they had resources and a stronger government, strengthened government, 2019, they hired their own environmental assessment folks, and they knew now the real risk that it was going to affect their wild rice beds, right? And they, after asking questions and knowing the real facts, then they did not want the pipeline there, right? And that's when he took the case. So.
Absolutely. The pipeline easements were renewed periodically in 1973, in 1993. By 1993, the tribal council, the tribal policy at that time, was in favor of renewing the pipeline for a limited period of years, and it was renewed at that point. When the next round of renewals came up in 2012, the tribal policies had changed, the awareness of the potential environmental damages had changed. Enbridge had recently at that point been responsible for the worst inland oil spill in U.S. history, the Kalamazoo spill in Line 6B. That woke people up. They took a harder look. They asked the company for environmental damage assessment, for safety protocols. They asked for information. They were not satisfied with the information that was received. They were not willing to put their resources at that risk. And so they asked the company to honor the lease agreement, which said as soon as the lease is up, if it's not renewed, you have 6 months to decommission your pipeline, remove it from the territory, restore the habitat and the ecosystem to the state it was in before the pipeline. The company simply refused to do it. Enbridge said, we're already in the ground and we're going to keep running. They required us to sue them into federal court, spend 3 years preparing a litigation, going through monstrous discovery, very onerous procedures and provisions to get into court, for the court to simply say, you're in trespass. You don't have a right to continue operating. I don't know why we're even arguing about this. You know that you don't have a right. You know that the tribe's property rights, the tribe's rights as a landowner, their ability to deny consent means you have to leave. And that's the decision we got. They spent 3 years making us do the runaround just to enforce the simplest right under property law. If you don't have a lease, you don't get to stay on someone else's land.
And so what happened? They made that decision, and then what happened?
They made the decision. The band sued. We represented the band in that litigation.
We as in the firm?
My firm, Kanji Katzen.
Yep.
We took them to court. We got a decision before the trial that they are indeed in trespass and they don't have any legal right or justification to continue operating. We did go to trial. There were 2 or 3 issues that remained to be litigated. The amount of trespass damages based on the profit that the company had made by illegally operating their pipeline within the band's reservation. How do you calculate those damages? The band received a judgment of just over $5 million for the illegal occupation during that period. Another critical issue was the timeline under which the company should be required to vacate the lands. The court told us up front, and somewhat understandably so, it was concerned about an immediate shutdown of that line and what the economic consequences would be, what the disruption to the oil market would be. And so we had litigation over what would be a reasonable time frame for withdrawal. The court decided that 3 years from the date of the judgment is when they would have to shut down their operations, decommission, and remove the pipeline.
Where are we at in that timeline as of right now?
That decision was just about 1 month ago, so coming up on 3 years.
So shutting down pipelines, getting land back, exercising tribal sovereignty. I mean, this is huge. It's also a huge message to these corporations, that we aren't fucking around as Indigenous people. Like, we will exercise our rights. We have lawyers that have come up through the ranks who hold in their heart, like yourself, Phillip, and many others, understand this law, the ins and outs of it, but also hold that heart and responsibility that we have as Indigenous people to stand up for one another, to stand up in the name of justice, and to stand up for Mother Earth. And so this is exciting. I think that a lot of times, being somebody who's fought at pipelines before, we know the stories that are heartbreaking of when we weren't victorious, when we didn't have the right strategy legally, or we didn't have the right strategy, but all we knew was to fight. And to hear this it's a breath of fresh air, quite frankly. And so, thank you for all of that hard work, and of course, many of the others, and many of the people who fought before there was a lawyer at the table.
Yes.
And this, this is like a reminder to tribal leaders and to grassroots organizers throughout the Indigenous world that we have power. We have to exercise that power, and we have to ask the questions and ask the details and push our lawyers to represent our interests. And so just, it's such a powerful thing to be able to understand that you take on one of the larger corporations in the world who's been one of the larger polluters, contributing to climate change, contributing to the destruction of not only the earth, but human rights. It's holding them accountable, they probably should pay more than $5 million, I think, is probably.
They should leave now.
Yeah, they can do the right thing and leave now too. So Nicole, like hearing this as an organizer, hearing this journey, this story, what comes up for you? What is like the emotions, the feeling of knowing all the things that went into this work? What does it bring up for you?
It brings up the organizers, the on-the-ground organizers. This decision was just made, and there's been so many organizers on the ground educating the public, educating the tribes, organizing against this lines that Mcgirt is running through Anishinaabe territories and other territories, right? And, it's line 3, line 5, line 6. And so it took a lot of organizing and consciousness too. And I think that does affect also the decisions made in the courts, all that organizing. So it brings for me the all that organizing that went behind it, and resources. As you mentioned, at times we didn't have lawyers, like Phillip and others who could represent. We didn't have resources. I mean, this case was one with very limited resources versus what Mcgirt had, right? That they could extend it to 3 years. And so the importance of having the resources as well to be able to fight these, it shows how important it is in the power dynamics that it brings when we're able to represent our own people, our own tribes with other tribal even attorneys, right? And it also, around food sovereignty, done a lot of work. I think this is a land back not only for the people, but this is a win for the wild rice. It's a win for the foods around those lands that will no longer have to experience that contamination in the future, that will be prioritized as they have to revitalize those lands back to its pristine ecosystem. And so it's a win that's what it brings for me too. It's a win for the rice. It's a win for traditional ways of life. And it's a win for the water and for all the foods around those territories.
Yeah, big shout outs to the Bad River Band, Lake Superior, Chippewa. I mean, the amount of tenacity over a long period of time, navigating through termination, all the way up into the the education and bringing along our people. A lot of times organizers, we're discredited. We're pushed off. We're throwaway. Oh, they're just the ones trying to be against everything. But when the reality is, a lot of what we are fighting for creates the condition for a better life. Mm-hmm. A life without contamination. A life where the wild rice is in abundance, where the ecosystem and the biological diversity is increased, where the very livelihood of our nations and our people have the ability to survive. Mm-hmm. And, with a lot of the work that we do here at Indian Collective is to change the conditions. We have a fundamental belief that when you invest into the self-determination of Indigenous people who are from these lands, to put them in the position to make decisions over their families, the lives and lands of their people, the impact of that will not just benefit that tribe or that community. It could benefit everybody downriver, everybody downwind, everybody, because we have holistic a view, a world view that all these systems are interconnected and all related. And so as people think about why is it so important to support Indigenous people, these are perfect examples of how advancements in tribal sovereignty and advancements to standing up for treaty rights actually make the world a better place for all people in Mother Earth. So as we wrap up, I really want to thank both of you for coming on this show. This show is about fighting for land rights and fighting for land back and fighting for the liberation of our people. And so just wanted to give you a few minutes to close out any last final comments that you have. We'll start with Phillip and then we'll go to Nicole.
Thank you, Nick. I think I just want to say regarding the Bad River case, as we were discussing, that is a victory that 100% belongs to the people of the Bad River community. And the elected leadership who had the tenacity to stand up to this multinational company with all of the money, all of the resources and power in the world, and to say, no, we have our rights and we will do whatever it takes to protect these resources. And the people of that community, the resource users, the very professional, dedicated, and well-resourced Tribal Natural Resources Department. We worked hand in hand with them for years to determine what resources were put at risk: the wild rice, the water, the maple sugar, all the animals and all the ecosystem that was in danger. We worked with them so closely. They had a wealth of knowledge, both modern scientific and traditional ecological, and they brought all that to bear. We had to put this information before the court so that it would understand we can't just let the company keep writing checks in perpetuity because those resources are worth so much more than money. There's no way to recover from the kind of damage that pipeline offered. And that was the information that only that community had, only that community could present. That was the sort of information that it takes to lead that case. So these cases are never won by attorneys alone. They're never won in a vacuum. It takes the people in the community. It takes the organizers, the activists. It takes people politically engaged. All of those pieces must come together. Land back is seen as such a big ask by the colonial establishment government. We know that it's not. It's only restorative justice and nothing more. But we have to fight every step of the way. 3 years in court with all of these people giving everything they have to make that victory happen, to just enforce the simplest right on the books. It's my land, you get off when I tell you to. But that's what the fight takes. And so everyone out here, whether you're in the political space or the activism space, direct action, contribute financially, contribute in whatever way you can to raise consciousness, raise awareness, and bring this fight where it needs to be. It's a community effort to have all of us on board to try to gain these victories.
You are trespassing. Sorry, bro. Sorry, not sorry. Get off our land. Period.
It feels so good to hear these victory stories, and I want to thank both of you for coming on the show and thank all of the audience for listening in to Land Back for the People. This stuff is real. We're not just out here screaming land back, putting our fist in the air. We're talking about real strategies to advance human rights, civil rights, tribal sovereignty, for the protection of Mother Earth and the protection of our people. Every human being across the world wants food, water, shelter, education, safety for their communities and for their people. That's a human trait. That is the same things that we are in the pursuit of as Indigenous people. And as we get our land back, it's proven that, and these cases prove that it changes the conditions, especially in this country as we're watching things be eroded over time. Tribal sovereignty and the advances of tribal sovereignty are standing up to the other side that is trying to dismantle and trying to destroy what is left here in this country and suck it dry for everything. And so these are examples that will go down in the history books. I think that we are only at the tip of the iceberg to understand the true impacts that both of these decisions in Mcgirt and both in the decisions with Bad River, I think that tribes are going to be able to take those decisions, make reference them on precedents that are going to help catalyze things forward. So as we close out here, I just want to give big shout outs to both Nicole, Phillip for being on the show. Also want to give big shout outs to Willie White, Steph Yera for our producers here, for all the hard work. There's a lot of work that goes into behind the scenes to try to make a Land Back for the People show happen. And we will continue to be here. We will continue to bring stories from the front lines, from the courts, and from the work that people are doing to fight for the liberation of Indigenous people and our land. So land back by any means necessary. Thanks for listening in. Rock on, good one. No, it felt good.
Yeah, I did.
Nicole, thanks for pushing us. This was not on the agenda. Nicole's like, hey, Phillip's here. We're gonna do this podcast.
I was organizing with Cole, Melissa, Willie.